Chapter 4 The Rendezvous. As I stepped out of the plane, I was greeted by the principal of the mission school and his wife, and introduced to nurses and teachers and other mission workers. We were soon surrounded by a throng of Indian and Eskimo children, eager to carry my bags, and then we all proceeded along the earth road on the river bank past the Anglican Cathedral and the Mission Hospital to the school. There was not an igloo in sight. Faces thronged the hospital windows as we passed. Everybody knew that I had come out direct from England. You could not come into Akavik unannounced, as the names of the plane passengers were radioed from Edmonton by the airline officials. We entered the school, and I was struck by the warmth, light, and spaciousness. Wide corridors, covered with polished linoleum, led into the distance, and across them moved oriental-looking children, padding softly by in moose-hide moccasins. I was taken upstairs to my bedroom, the replica of any similar type of bedroom in civilization, with its bedside table and lamp, dressing table and mirror, wardrobe and easy chair. The windows at the far end of the long, narrow room overlooked 2 or 3 Indian cabins and a stretch of bushy country. From outside, I heard the howling of dogs, and I hoped soon to make friends with them. I hung up my coat and was about to go downstairs to the meal which I had been told awaited me, when I saw the letter on the dressing table. I'd been hurt by Roger's absence from the party which had welcomed me. Was he not as anxious to meet me as I was to meet him? Now surely I was to learn what had detained him. Perhaps he even intended to call on me that evening. I opened the note and read the apology. He was sorry to miss my arrival, but this was a busy time of the year for him, and he would be down river cutting his winter supply of cordwood for 2 or 3 weeks. However, he had a suggestion to make. On my first afternoon off duty, I should go out for a walk. There is a trail along the beach in the direction away from the town. It is the same trail that I follow winter and summer to get your letters. If you walked along it a little way, you might find a rough and unprepossessing character coming to meet you. He's been moving towards you for nearly 8 years now, and if you find him at last on an Arctic beach, among the long yellowing grass and the sere willows, probably you find him where he belongs. Walk with him through the fallen leaves and coarse marsh grasses, and he will be at ease with you, and you might even feel at home with him. Disappointed but placated, I tripped downstairs. In the big kitchen I found a friendly gathering. I soon discovered that the mission kitchen was a favorite meeting place after duty hours. There were more introductions and inquiries about England. People were dropping in all the time, on their way to collect the mail which had come in on the plane. Strapping young fellows in the uniform of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, personnel of the Royal Signals Detachment, who dealt with radio communications, the district administrator, and the chief game warden, and girls from the mission hospital staff. They all dropped in for a Saturday afternoon gossip. At 6 o'clock I went with the rest of the staff into the children's dining room for evening prayers, and I saw the school assembled, rows of gleaming black heads and brown faces with merry almond-shaped eyes. The girls' shining braids were decorated with blue and scarlet hair slides and satin ribbons, and the boys wore red checked cowboy shirts and blue jeans. When the little girls went to bed, I asked permission to go up to their dormitory to say good night to them. The children sat shyly on their beds and waited for me to speak. I'd been told that they were of two races, Lauchuks, Indian, and Eskimo, but I could not yet distinguish between them. I sat on the nearest bed, searching in my mind for a topic which might interest them. At last I said, "Have you any huskies? I'm longing to see the huskies." There was a moment of surprised silence, and then a little voice piped up at my elbow, "I, husky," and several of the children scrambled out of bed and came running down the room in their flannelette nightgowns, saying eagerly, "I husky, I husky." "Oh no," I said, "huskies are dogs, aren't they?" And they turned dejectedly away and went back to their beds, wondering why they had made such an odd claim. I changed the subject and told them instead something about my long journey. The next morning at breakfast in the staff dining room, the matron told us of trouble in the playroom. She was puzzled. The Luchek's children, she said, had been taunting the Eskimos, saying, "Huskies are dogs." "Well, huskies are dogs, aren't they?" I commented. "Husky means Eskimo, I was told. There are husky dogs, but down here huskies generally mean Eskimo people." I soon found that Roger had been far too optimistic in anticipating that I should have time to go walking. The pressure of duties in an understaffed boarding school was something I had never experienced. My day began with the rising bell at 6:45 a.m., and I soon learned to respond to it at once in order to get first turn in the washroom. The bathroom for women members of the staff was next to my bedroom. In it there were several enamel bowls and jugs, and a bath on a dais behind a curtain. All water had to be carried in pails from the kitchen. If I was delayed in getting into the bathroom, I had to hurry to be down for breakfast by 7:30. At 8 o'clock, pupils and staff filed into the dining room for morning prayers, after which there were the household chores to attend to, beds to make, and rooms to dust, and mats to shake. The little girls generally vied for the privilege of doing this last. Then there was time to do some marking of books before school began at 9:30. At 10:30 a bell rang. The children keyed up for cookies, and then went for a quarter hour of recreation outside, or, when the weather became colder, in the playroom, while the staff repaired to the kitchen for coffee, cookies, and conversation. From 10:45 there was another hour of school, then dinner. This was over by 12:30, and afternoon school did not begin until 2:30. During this 2-hour break, the supervisors took charge of the children, and the teachers were off duty. So I looked forward to visits round the settlement during the noon hour. I had no conception as yet of what going for a walk would involve when temperatures remained far below zero. I soon found, too, that I needed all the midday spare time for the performance of personal domestic tasks in the laundry. In the afternoon, school went on until 5 p.m., with a short break at 3:30 for tea and cookies. At 5:15 came supper. This was the main meal of the day, and once or twice a week the mission entertained guests for supper, young Mounties or Hudson's Bay Company clerks on their afternoon off-duty. The older pupils waited at table efficiently and unobtrusively. After supper, there were prayers in the dining hall at 6 o'clock. Then followed recreational activities. Until bedtime, scouts and guides, cubs and brownies, women's auxiliary meetings, cathedral choir practice. These were all taken by members of the staff. In their leisure time, the girls worked native handicraft, and the boys played checkers or cribbage. The little children went to bed at 7:30, and the older ones at 8 p.m., and so by 8:30 all the staff, except the 2 members on duty that night, were free to relax. The duty staff patrolled the dormitories from time to time until 10:30, by which time most people were ready to retire. Once a fortnight we had a full 24 hours off duty, and in the intervening week half a day off. But I found that as the weather became too rigorous for outdoor exercise, there was little refreshment in the off-duty period. One stayed in the building, and so there was no escape from the inevitable noise of children. Sometimes, however, an understanding person, like the wife of the game warden or the signals sergeant major, would invite one of the staff out to supper, and that provided a welcome change of scene. As soon as the opportunity arose, I asked about Roger. "Is there a man named Roger Wilton living near Auclavik?" "Yes, there is," was the reply. "Do you know him?" "I've never met him," I said, "but I heard when I was in England that he was living here. He lives by himself in a shack out in the bush, they said, and often drops in here in the evenings when he comes to town. He hasn't been in lately," someone added. "I guess he's down river. We could ask him to supper if you would like to meet him," the matron said. "Thank you," I replied. A couple of weeks later, I was wondering how I could make the best use of my first whole holiday when I was told, "Roger Wilton is coming to supper tonight," so I decided to forgo the pleasure of going out to explore and spend the afternoon getting my schoolwork finished, marking books, and preparing lessons. Then I could give the evening to him with undivided mind, and perhaps he would take me round the town, introduce me to his friends among the native population, give me a chance to feel that I really was living in the North. I looked forward also to the prospect of some stimulating conversation. I had found the conversational atmosphere so far unexpectedly arid. There was so much that was thrilling in this northern way of life that I could not understand why mealtime discussions were concerned exclusively with trivialities. Now that Roger was coming to supper, I should doubtless sit open-mouthed while the conversation sparkled around me. I wanted to look as nice as possible for this moment of meeting, but I had not much choice of ensemble. My trunk had got no nearer than Edmonton. One thing was certain, I should not need to appear in the tweedy sort of outfit that would be appropriate wear on an English autumn day. In the Arctic I found it was so warm indoors that you dressed in silks and cottons. So I put on a royal blue linen suit with turquoise silk blouse and wore it, one on each wrist, my treasured Haida Indian silver bracelets. The gong sounded, and I closed the bedroom door behind me. I came slowly down the stairs, savoring the pleasant supper-time smell from the kitchen, past whose open door the files of little girls were moving decorously towards their dining room. I opened the staff room door. I was late. The table was full, and everyone was awaiting me. Across the table an additional place had been laid, opposite to mine. I heard the matron say, "I'd like you to meet Roger Wilton," and a slim, bearded figure unfolded itself and rose to an unexpected height, extending an arm which was too long for the sleeve of the jacket. A deep voice said quietly, "Miss Taylor, I presume." I looked up to meet his eyes. For a moment I thought the cliché had been used deliberately, and I was ready to respond with a smile, but there was no hint of a smile in Roger's answering gaze. I had a brief impression of the lean height of him, the curl of his golden beard, the resonance of his voice, the fragrance of his clothing, saturated with the scent of wood smoke. All these external qualities fitted my picture admirably. As the meal progressed, Roger paid no more attention to me, and the conversation was as brittle as usual. Afterwards, when the others had withdrawn to their various duties, the two of us sat by the stove, and I tried to take up the acquaintance where we had left it off on paper, but Roger was uncommunicative. It transpired that he was no longer a trapper. In this area, the game law prohibited trapping to the incoming white man. His present occupation was wood cutting, and he had a lonely woodcutter's camp back in the bush. He had come north, he explained, in search of solitude. Did I detect a hint of resentment at my intrusion into his privacy? Chapter 5. First Impressions. There was no school board or education committee in charge of the educational system in Aklavik. Authority came directly from Ottawa, 5,000 miles away. The Northwest Territories, in spite of their enormous territorial extent, were not a province administered by a provincial government. Their administration was the responsibility of a federal government department called the Department of Resources and Development, the deputy minister of which was at the same time director of the NWT administration and commissioner of the NWT under him. The superintendent of education for the Mackenzie district of the NWT, an official resident in Ottawa, was responsible for the supervision and inspection of schools in Aklavik. The academic standard required of the pupils was parallel with that laid down by the Education Department of the province of Alberta in its official program of studies. I was relieved to find that the school principal was prepared to allow me some latitude in interpreting this. The duties of the principal of an Indian and Eskimo residential school were varied and exacting. He needed to be backwoodsman as well as a pedagogue. Professionally, he must train his pupils to fulfill the educational standards demanded. Practically, he must also be a jack of all trades. Supplies must be estimated and ordered a year in advance. Not merely supplies of stationery, but also food, fuel, household furnishings, medical requirements, cleaning materials, etc. In the wintertime, when lakes and rivers were feet deep under ice, he must know how to ensure a steady flow of water into the tanks in the basement. In the summertime, when the Eskimo pupils had to be transported to the Arctic coast to rejoin their families, he must be able to pilot the boat load of children through the maze of channels of 70 miles of delta. When the trapping season opened, he was responsible for organizing the training of the older pupils in their native skills. He must understand the Oriental mind and earn the confidence of the children and their parents, and deal tactfully with differences between members of staff. Mr. Gibson fulfilled these duties excellently. He also had a bubbling sense of humor. In my class, I had 36 pupils between the ages of 9 and 13 years. They all spoke English more or less fluently, but they were so shy that it was several weeks before they could bring themselves to speak to me, and at first I thought I should never get to know them. They hung their heads when I looked at them, sat mute when I spoke to them, buried their heads in their arms if I made them conspicuous, dissolved into tears if I brought them out to the front of the class, even if I intended only to commend their work. There seemed to be very little aggression in them. They did not argue and quarrel with each other like English children, and I never saw the boys put up their fists. I began to despair of getting any audible response to my questions. An inquiry such as, "Do you know how to use a dictionary?" would be received in silence, though one or two pairs of eyes would be lifted to my face. I would repeat gently. Any sign of irritation was fatal. "Can anyone use a dictionary?" And if my ears failed to catch the whispered sibilant which indicated that someone had said yes, I would begin to explain its use, only to realize a few minutes later that they were quite conversant with it. I was glad to find that it was not a tradition of repressive discipline which contributed to this shyness. There was a natural freedom of behavior in all the children which was pleasant to see. The diffidence derived from the pattern of early home life, when strangers were seldom met. The Eskimo children came to the school from a solitary life in the bush or on the Arctic coast, and most of the Indian children came from Fort McPherson, an Indian village containing only a few white people. In time I came to find that they were affectionate and tender-hearted children, accepting with resignation the joys and sorrows of their life. I now began to discover the answers to some of the questions that had occupied my mind ever since I had known that I was going to live in the North. I could not conceive what happened to the plumbing, for instance, when temperatures remained below zero for weeks on end. How was the drinking water induced to flow? How did the fire brigade operate in an emergency? What happened to the sewage? I found that drinking water came in solid form, cut out of the frozen river. It was not long after my arrival that the operation of cutting out the ice began. Upstream from the town, the surface of the river was marked out into plots, each about the size of a tennis court. These were checkered by lines at right angles, and men with long-handled saws cut along these lines. The blocks were pulled out of the water with ice tongs and loaded onto a stone boat, a wooden platform on skis. A caterpillar tractor dragged the stone boat up the river bank and trundled backwards and forwards, delivering the gleaming blue-green ice cubes to be piled up outside the dwellings. Twice a day at the school, an ice block was dropped into the drinking water tank in the furnace room. As the block thawed, water gathered in the container, and when the tap at the bottom of the tank was turned, ice-cold water came out. Sometimes, to help the thaw, a kettle full of boiling water was poured on the ice. The water which came out of the tap was still ice-cold. It would have needed a mountain of ice blocks to provide adequately for the domestic requirements of our household of about 120 persons. With regards to cleanliness, so some system had to be devised to enable water to be drawn from under the ice. Out on the river, a pumping engine had been assembled with a pipe penetrating the ice. It was housed in a heated shack. Every 2 or 3 days in the winter, the fire was lit and well stoked with wood. Water pumped up from the river passed along a boiler pipe which made several U-turns through the hot flame. Then it went romping through long hoses across 200 yards of river bank into big storage tanks in the school basement until they were replenished. The children bathed once a week. On Thursdays, the girls had to forego their dinner hour walk. 4 big tubs were put out in the furnace room and filled with hot water, and 54 little girls followed each other at intervals down the stairs in their nightgowns, their long, silky black tresses flowing free. Each bath accommodated 3 children at a time, the bigger girls bathing the tiny ones. After the bath, they scampered upstairs again to receive a complete change of clothing. On Fridays, it was the turn of the boys. Sewage disposal was a tough proposition. Underground pipes could not function. There were only a few inches of soil covering the permafrost, and here there were no steam pipes, as in Norman Wells. In the Anglican mission, I found that the night pails were carried downstairs and their contents emptied into empty oil drums, which were kept in a heated shack euphemistically referred to as the honey house. These drums were collected every other day and towed away by caterpillar tractor out into the middle of the river, well below the town site. The refuse was emptied onto the ice, where in a few minutes it was frozen as hard as a rock, and when the thaw came in June, it all slipped into the water and was borne away to the Arctic Ocean. The waste water from the washrooms was brought down daily by the bigger girls, and tipped into an open ditch where it froze at once. I was told that the outbreak of fire was a hazard for which insurance agents declined to make provision, except at a very high premium. All the buildings in the town were made of wood, and for 9 months of the year fires had to be maintained in them day and night. A night watchman on full-time duty patrolled all public buildings, stoking fires during the night in schools, offices, and hospitals. The manager of the Hudson's Bay Company store was the fire chief, and his brigade was composed of all the able-bodied men in town, white and native, who were under orders to drop whatever they were doing and run to the fire hall if the alarm should sound. Out on the ice in front of the bay was another pumping engine ready for action in an emergency. Here the boiler fire was kept burning day and night. It was on a night in February when the moonlit sky was Mediterranean blue that the wail of the fire siren curdled our blood. Struggling into our fur boots and heavy clothing, we raced for the center of town, where a store was ablaze in a ball of orange flame. Opposite to it were the cabins of the Royal Canadian Signals, full of valuable equipment, our link with the outside in case of emergency. Behind the store were warehouses containing precious fur waiting to be shipped out, and provisions to last the community until the river was open to incoming freight. In half an hour, the water running through the hoses had turned to ice, and fire extinguishers had been exhausted, spraying the roof of the neighboring bakery against the danger from falling sparks. Then the only effective countermeasure the fire brigade could take was to try to confine the flames. A bulldozer was brought up to drive a wall of snow around the premises, and poles were used as battering rams to ensure that the burning walls collapsed inwards. Volleys from the exploding cans of beans and other foods spattered the air, and a burning sack of salt sent up a shaft of blue-green flame high into the sky. The fire had to be allowed to burn itself out, and the ashes smoldered for over a week. We were grateful that no one was injured. The mission school staff were all so busy about their various duties that they met only at meal times during the day. The staff room was T-shaped. A long, narrow dining room opened at the end into a square sitting room, furnished with easy chairs and a settee and a piano, and with a central wood-burning stove to provide extra heating. At breakfast time, the table was presided over by the school principal, Mr. Gibson, the school matron sitting opposite to him and the other end of the table. On his right sat Mr. James, the newly appointed engineer, then Muriel, in charge of the cooking, and Gwen, who was the teacher of the youngest children. Beyond Gwen sat Elsie, the sewing matron, or Vera, the girls' supervisor. whichever one was not on duty in the children's dining room. On Mr. Gibson's left sat Miss James, the boys' supervisor. I admired her pluck in coming to tackle this job, for which she had no special training, in order to accompany her husband. She used to range the boys along the corridor, making them sit on the floor with needle and thread to mend their moose-hide mitts and moccasins. Ralph was next to Miss James, opposite to his wife, Muriel. He taught the senior class, and had come north with the fond anticipation of having time in this isolated environment to study for extra examination qualifications. He soon found that this was impossible. When his teaching day was done, his time continued to be fully occupied with supervision duties and Boy Scout activities. Next to Ralph sat Margot, the laundry matron, and I was next to her. Gwen's conversation was always positive and emphatic. Margot was more frivolously inclined, being interested in film stars and beauty preparations. The most colorful member of the mission staff, however, and the oldest resident, apart from Mr. Gibson, was Mission Pete, a former trapper who was now established as the school's handyman. He had charge of the 5 dogs, the furnaces, the piping of water from the river, the meat supply, sanitary arrangements, and he presided at all meals except breakfast. He also supervised and directed the squads of boys in their outdoor tasks, such as log carrying and ice distributing. Mr. James, the engineer, seemed something of an enigma. He was a big man with rosy cheeks and blue eyes that I expected every moment to crinkle into smiles, but he never smiled. He divided his time between the school and the town, and I, cloistered as I was by the pressure of my duties, envied him his opportunity of getting to know people. He said he had come to Canada from South Wales in the Depression years, and I assumed that Jimmy would be my ally in any little disputes which might arise regarding the respective merits of Canadian and British products and institutions. I had embarked on this new experience of living in a missionary community with a sense of my own inadequacy. I expected now to find myself among people conscious of living dedicated lives. I anticipated that mealtime conversations would be maintained on a high plane, and that the expression of personal opinions would be tempered by Christian charity. I had some surprises. To begin with, the most important subject of conversation concerned the arrival of the new clerk for the bay, my flight companion, Hebridean Andy. There was already a Scottish Andy at the bay, a gay, red-haired Glaswegian. The new Andy was such a contrast that speculation was rife. Maybe he was a Scottish laird in disgrace. There were also recent arrivals at the barracks of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, whose attractions must be catalogued. The younger girls on the staff were soon discreetly staking claims. There was even, it seemed, a Mountie come from Yorkshire who had been allotted to me unseen, since I also came from England. In the evenings the school buildings would be pealing with merriment. The boys' and girls' playrooms were at opposite ends of the main corridor, and in them were held such activities as skipping contests and indoor camp fire sessions. It seemed very odd to hear again the scout and guide choruses with which I had once been so familiar, floating on this northern air. After the children had gone to bed, the staff kept open house in the big kitchen. This was the nicest time of the day. 2 large coffee percolators would be bubbling on the kitchen stove, and Muriel's homemade cakes in generous supply. For an hour or so the coffee cups were filled and refilled, and we laughed and chatted. If Mr. Gibson joined us for a time, his subtle remarks would be sure to add to the laughter. When the Indian members of the staff were present, the Reverend James Sitchinelli or Thomas Jutli, I waited eagerly for the enthralling but casually related accounts of Arctic adventures which were sure to follow, of experiences driving dog teams, getting lost in blizzards, digging out a sleeping hole in the snow when the mercury was down below 0. How much more of a man's job that seemed to me than was, for instance, the job of selling nylon stockings in a city store. Being so removed far from Europe, which to me had always been the hub of the universe, I had felt that my first requirement was to know how to get in contact with it by wireless program. There was a radio in the staff sitting room on which news from the British Broadcasting Corporation's overseas service could be picked up at 8 a.m., and I made for this as soon as I came downstairs. There was no competition. Nobody else was interested in the news from Europe, and they thought I was a bit odd to fuss about it. The quality of radio reception was unpredictable. Sometimes the program was received clearly and distinctly, sometimes it could be heard only faintly, and sometimes there was no sound at all. Pete said this was because of our proximity to the magnetic pole, but the international problems which occupied my mind did not raise even a flicker of interest in the younger members of the staff. One evening I was discussing a pronouncement of the British government when Pete said, "Well, what does it matter anyway? Britain's finished." I looked at him, thinking I must have misheard. "What did you say?" I asked. "Britain's finished," he repeated. "Washed out. Through." Jimmy joined in. "Britain is no longer one of the great powers of the world," he said. "She's had it." "This was a preposterous suggestion," I said slowly. "Do you mean that you think Britain's pronouncements are of no more consequence in world affairs?" "Sure," said Jimmy. "Britain's day is past. America is the #1 power now. She's got the money." "Oh, I see," I said, relieved. "You mean America is the richest country." "Sure," said Pete. "The USA has got the dough. She's the boss now." "But it is not just money that makes a country great," I said. "No," said Jimmy. "Well, what else?" "The integrity of her leaders and the efforts of her people, of course," I replied. "But you got to have money first," said Pete. It seemed as though the conception of Britain as a lesser power gave satisfaction to some of my companions. 200 or 300 yards from the school was the Anglican Mission Hospital, containing 70 or 80 beds. Half a dozen of these were reversed for emergency casualties or maternity cases among the white population. All the rest were occupied by native people suffering from tuberculosis. Great vigilance on this account was exercised with regard to the health of the school children. One afternoon during my first week in school, I was surprised to see the matron enter my classroom and go flitting round among the desks, popping a thermometer in every mouth. When she reached the end of the class, she started the circuit again, taking out the thermometers and from time to time making entries in her notebook. This temperature testing was done once a week. Once a month, the children filing into the dining room for dinner stepped in turn onto a pair of scales. Weights were recorded and compared with those of the previous month. If a fluctuation in weight or temperature gave any cause for disquiet, the matter was dealt with at once, the child being given a period of only half-day attendance at school, the afternoons being spent in bed. Twice a year, the whole school was x-rayed, and there were annual inoculations against various diseases. The matron was so adept at giving inoculations that she could do 80 in 3/4 of an hour. The process was called getting a poke, and I found that when staff and pupils all got a poke at the same time, there was no chance of having 48 hours off duty after it, as I had done in the army during the war. In the North, you were expected to be tough. Halloween was to be celebrated with parties. In accordance with Canadian tradition, the grown-ups were invited to a ball in the community hall, at which masks and fancy dress would be worn, and for weeks beforehand there was much whispering among the younger members of the staffs at the school and the hospital, who exchanged frequent visits to discuss costumes. On the night before Halloween, a number of ladies gathered round the long table in the mission kitchen to prepare the refreshments. They made over 1,000 sandwiches, wrapped them in damp cloths, packed them into tins, and carried them across to the hall. When costume secrets were revealed, the matron was found to be a Spanish señorita with a black lace mantilla and a red rose. Elsie had made a crinoline from an old bedspread with hoops sewn into it. Muriel was the trainer of Miss Gibson, as the bear sustaining this role was a bit of an endurance test, not only from the heat in the hall, but because the bearskin was a bit high. Gwen and Margot had cast the 2 Scotch Andes from the Hudson's Bay Company store as angels. One of them had been loth to sacrifice his neat black mustache. They wore white robes and wings with long flaxen hair and golden halos, and carried Easter lilies made of crepe paper. All I had been able to contrive was a winter sports outfit. I had a pair of white flannel pajamas with a ski design on them, and I wore with them white boots and a white fur cap, and carried a pair of skis. We set out for the hall, wearing ski pants and parkas over our party garments. It was a lovely night, the northern lights weaving in and out among the stars in the dipper like enormous wreaths of pale green steam. When the door was opened and we entered the hall, I was amazed by the color and gaiety inside the room. Everyone was in disguise. I recalled the commiserations of my friends in England, who had taken it for granted that in going to work in a mission in the Arctic, I was going into seclusion. When outer garments had been disposed of, the fiddlers and guitarist struck a chord to announce the parade, and the throng began to circle the judges. There were costumes dignified and comic, modern and medieval, topical and traditional. The cannon's wife had been transformed into a buxom milkmaid by the girls on the hospital staff. They had made her a sunbonnet and a velvet corselet, draped a curtain like panniers round her striped skirt, and fitted her up with a cow in the form of a couple of boys covered with a buffalo robe. The milkmaid carried a three-legged stool and a pail, and while the judges were deliberating, she calmly sat down in the middle of the floor and milked her cow. A stream of real milk flowed into the pail from a jug concealed by one of the boys. This caused great amusement, and the judges acclaimed her the first prize winner. The prize was a box of chocolates, which she handed over to the delighted cow. The community hall was now jammed to captivity. The stove gave out a great heat, and every time the outside door was opened, the hot air rushed out in a white cloud. Whiskey was circulating freely outside the hall, and soon the angels, with halos awry and little runnels of perspiration streaking their makeup, were brandishing cigars instead of lilies. Supper was announced, and the company keyed for coffee, sandwiches, and cakes. Dazed by the conviviality of the occasion, I murmured to my neighbor, "Who would think we were in the Arctic?" Then I took a bite of my sandwich and found that the contents were sealed in ice. We had forgotten that the hall would be unheated overnight. Chapter 6. Sled Dogs. I had by now become acquainted with sled dogs. On Sunday, the day after my arrival, I had asked if I might accompany the girls on their afternoon walk, so that I could begin to get to know something about my environment. I took my camera with me, in the hope of coming across a good subject for a picture. The crocodile of girls wound along the earth road which bordered the river, through the mission grounds, past the post office and the oil storage tanks, the signals detachment's quarters, the Canadian Pacific Airlines Agency, the government administrator's house, the Hudson's Bay Company store, toward the Roman Catholic mission grounds. On our left, the ground dropped steeply to the river. On our right, there was a row of Indian cabins. The landscape was well covered with snow, and the fringe of ice was already reaching out into the water. Hearing a shout from behind, I turned and saw, to my delight, a dog team some way back, galloping down the center of the road. With an exclamation of pleasure, I put up my hand like a traffic policeman and shouted, "Stop, I want a picture." Vera and the girls had by now unaccountably disappeared. I realized that some were at the bottom of the river bank, and the rest were hiding behind the cabins and making frantic signals to me. I looked back to the road. The Indian on the toboggan had run his team into the side of the road and halted them. I wanted to fondle the dogs, and I started to cross towards them. The Indian waved me back. "The dogs kill you," he said urgently, very fierce. So I had to admire them from a distance. They looked very pretty, 7 of them, in file, in the tandem hitch that is used in country where there are trees. In the eastern Arctic, the dogs are hitched in line abreast in what is called the fan. Hitch. I took my photographs and the team lopped off. Then the girls gathered round me again and asked if I was crazy and said that a running team will leap onto anything which stands in its way and tear it to pieces. Pete heard of the incident at supper time, and he told me that I had been courting death. The trapper himself must be careful not to stumble and fall in front of the dogs when he is walking ahead of them. To break trail after the first heavy snowfall, even his own dogs will leap upon him. After school, on the first morning, I went out into the yard during the dinner hour. Some of the boys were hitching up the school's 5 dogs, great, furry, huggable-looking beasts. I went towards them with my hand outstretched, ready to make friends. The boys said apprehensively, "I shouldn't go near them, miss." "Why not?" I asked. "They don't like strangers." "Oh," I said, "I know how to approach nervous dogs." At that moment Pete appeared in the doorway of the warehouse. "Get away from those dogs," he yelled, without ceremony. I stopped. "Why?" I asked. "Do you want to lose your hand?" he demanded. "But I can manage dogs," I insisted. "Not these dogs. You can't," he said. "They'll kill you." And that evening at supper time, they set out to tell me of some recent incidents involving sled dogs. The town had still not recovered from the shock of the news of an accident that had happened at a Royal Canadian Mounted Police post up river shortly before my arrival. A Mountie out on patrol duty, which involved visiting trappers and Indians' camps over a wide area, had become short of dog food, so that his team had had to run the last day with empty bellies. When he reached home, before unhitching the dogs, he asked his wife to prepare food for them. While he was putting away his stores, he did not notice that she had gone straight out with the food. The next moment there was a scream. He grabbed his rifle and leapt out of the door, but he was too late. The dogs had killed her. A few years earlier, when day pupils from homes across the river attended the mission school, a little boy had been coming to school one day in the deep snow. There was a narrow trail, just the width of a sled, up from the river, between the banks of snow, and the child was halfway up this path when he saw the leading dog of a team appear over the top of the bank. He made a frantic attempt to get out of the way, but the snow was too deep to allow him to scramble up the bank, and when the driver saw the child, all his strength was not enough to hold the dog's back. On another occasion, a toddler in Aklavik went up to a staked dog of a strange team, and with one snap the dog severed his jugular vein. The savagery of these timber wolf dogs of the Northwest Territories is the result of their inheritance. They are literally crossbred with wolves. Roger had told me that at certain times the bitch is tied out in the bush, and if it is a remote place where no dog can get at her, the male wolves will hear and respond to her mating call. At any other time, the timber wolves will kill and eat any dog they can get hold of. The half-wolf puppies are then mated again with a dog, and the quarter strain of a wolf in their progeny makes a good dog. But since the origins of a man's own dogs may be obscure, he may end up with more wolf blood than he bargained for. The crossbreeding maintains the desired husky characteristics: tough feet, physical size and strength, a dense underfur which thickens up in winter, strong jaws and teeth, and the ability to thrive on the alternate feast and famine conditions which often prevail. I even heard of a white trapper who obtained a female wolf cub and later bred it with a sled dog. While she was raising her pups, her native savagery came to the fore and was acquired by her pups, so that when they were old enough to wean, they were too wild and vicious to handle. In the same way, if a husky bitch is not penned up when her pups are born, she will make her own secret den in the bush and defeat all efforts to trail her there. And when eventually the pups are big enough to move around, they will be as wild as wolves. It is on this account that the laws about the treatment of sled dogs within a settlement are so strictly enforced. Wandering dogs constitute a danger to human life, so all dogs above the age of about 3 months must be fastened to stakes by short chains. They spend their lives, except when they are working, staked among the willows or along the river bank, in temperatures down to 60 degrees below zero. In blizzards they curl up with their noses tucked under their tails, and the snow covers them till they look like little snowdrifts. I found this out to my cost. One day, when walking on the river bank, I passed a mound of snow, which suddenly erupted into a menacing sled dog, and I had to make a quick detour. In the summertime, the dogs get little exercise, and they lie panting with the heat, tormented by mosquitoes. I begged to be allowed to take the school dogs for a walk. They would tolerate my society by that time. And to humor me, Pete took one of them off the stake and handed me the end of the chain. He might as well have handed me a galloping horse. After the first snow, when the trapper takes out the harness, the dogs are wild with excitement. The lines are attached to a padded collar round the dog's neck, then pass on directly to the body strap of the next dog. The lines from the last dog clip on to the toboggan. There is no bit in the dog's mouth, and I wondered how the driver induced his team to turn corners. I learned that the trapper teaches them to respond to 2 words, one indicating right and the other left. Around Aklavik, the words were ye and ha. At the appropriate command, no matter how softly it was spoken, the lead dog would swing to the right or left, and the rest must needs follow him. Driving a toboggan is an acquired art. Andy, at the Bay straight out from Scotland, had nevertheless to take his turn at driving the company's team of dogs, and he entertained us one evening with an account of his early experiences. The dogs do not readily stand and wait. When the driver dismounts, they are eager to be off again, and are likely to be on the move before he is aboard. If he is not nimble enough to leap onto the platform at the back of the toboggan before they are away, he can grab the long rope, which trails behind it precisely for this purpose. Andy had driven his team successfully across a lake, stepped off to fix the lace of his mucklucks, and been a second too late in jumping on again. The dogs, now headed for home, were off at top speed, and Andy grabbed the rope, missed his footing, and was taken all the way across the lake on his stomach. The rope can also be a lifeline. Soon after my arrival, by the time the river was frozen from bank to bank, the sledges were passing backwards and forwards every day, and the ice in front of the town site was dotted with little figures of people, jiggling, obtaining their winter supply of dog feed by fishing through a hole in the ice. One day, 2 Eskimo women were bringing home a load of fish on their toboggan. There were pockets of thinner ice. These presented no hazard, while the outfit traveled at speed, but on this occasion, the loaded toboggan was going slowly. Suddenly, the ice gave way, and Carolyn plunged into the river. She had enough presence of mind to grab the guide rope, but her now frozen mitts were too slippery to hold it. So she held it between her teeth, and the dogs pulled her out. Sled dogs, like wolves, generally have ears erect and eyes light in color, and slit slant instead of round. They are also given to howling rather than barking. It was not until Christmas time, when there were 700 dogs in town, that I heard the true canine symphony of the North. The concerted howling fills the air with noise. It starts when a single dog lifts up its voice on a long sustained note of fairly high pitch. Then its neighbors near and far join in a cacophony of altos and tenors and basses, punctuated by a few staccato barks, and the sound drowns even that of the caterpillar tractor, swelling and lingering until suddenly it stops, the sound cut off as if with a knife. It is a noise you grow to enjoy, a discord which is not discordant. And when you return to civilization, in spite of the hum and roar of the traffic, the air seems empty of sound. For the moment, however, from my boredom overlooking the bush, I was distressed by the pitiful howling of a single dog staked out in the willows behind one of the Indian cabins. I thought he howled because he was hungry or thirsty, and I suffered with him, till I could endure it no longer. Then I found my way to the cabin and knocked on the door. "For goodness sake," I said, "will you please give your dog something to eat or drink? I can't bear to hear him howling." The old lady looked at me in astonishment. Then she said simply, "Him young dog, him want woman," and I retired abashed.